The dust kicked up by Samuel's horse settled slowly in the evening air as he approached the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary, a habit he'd developed during his years as a circuit preacher traveling the untamed territories of the American West. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the wooden buildings in shades of amber and gold, while the distant mountains stood like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. Samuel had always believed that God guided his path, leading him from one settlement to another, bringing salvation to souls hungry for redemption. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both the beauty and brutality of frontier life. His dark hair was touched with premature gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held the kind of depth that came from witnessing both miracles and tragedies in equal measure. As he rode down the main street, he noticed the town was livelier than most he'd encountered. Saloon music drifted through the evening air, mixing with the sounds of horses and wagons, the chatter of townsfolk, and the occasional burst of laughter. Cedar Ridge was clearly a town where people worked hard and played harder, a place where the line between salvation and sin was drawn in the shifting sands of survival. Samuel dismounted in front of the modest church, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side. The building needed repair, its paint peeling and some of the boards warped from years of harsh weather. But it was a house of God nonetheless. Samuel felt the familiar stirring in his chest that came with each new calling. The church door creaked as he pushed it open, and he was surprised to find the interior clean and well-maintained despite the building's exterior condition. Someone had been caring for this place, keeping it ready for worship even without a permanent preacher. Wooden pews lined the small nave, and a simple wooden cross hung behind the altar. Wildflowers in mason jars adorned the windowsills, their sweet fragrance mixing with the scent of old wood and candle wax. Samuel was arranging his few belongings in the small room behind the sanctuary when he heard footsteps on the wooden floor. He turned to see a woman silhouetted in the doorway, her figure backlit by the golden evening light streaming through the church's front entrance. She stepped forward, and Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost ethereal in the soft light. Her auburn hair was pinned up loosely, with rebellious strands framing her face. Her green eyes held an intelligence and strength that immediately captivated him. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her coloring, and she moved with a grace that seemed at odds with the rough frontier town surrounding them. "You must be the new preacher," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Elizabeth Murphy. I've been looking after the church while we waited for someone to come." Samuel found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Samuel Harrison. I'm grateful for your care of this place, Miss Murphy. It shows in every detail." "Mrs. Murphy," she corrected gently, and Samuel noticed the simple gold band on her finger. "Though my husband passed 2 years ago, I find comfort in keeping busy, and the church needed tending." There was something in her eyes when she mentioned her late husband, a shadow that spoke of pain that had been carefully tucked away but never truly healed. Samuel recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror after losing his parents to fever when he was barely 20. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely, "and thank you for maintaining God's house. It speaks well of your character and faith." Elizabeth smiled, and the expression transformed her face completely, chasing away the shadows and revealing a warmth that made Samuel's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "Faith gets tested out here more than most places, Preacher Harrison, but it's all we have to hold on to when the storms come." They talked for nearly an hour as the sun set completely and the church grew dim. Elizabeth told him about the town, its people, their struggles and joys. She spoke of the harsh winters, the unpredictable weather, the challenges of building a life in a place where civilization was still a fragile thing. But she also talked about the community that had formed despite the hardships, the way neighbors helped each other through difficult times, and the simple pleasures that made frontier life bearable. Samuel found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the way her eyes lit up when she discussed the children in town, the gentle way she handled the church's wildflowers, the strength in her voice when she spoke of overcoming adversity. He realized he was drawn to her in a way that went beyond mere physical attraction, though that was certainly present. There was something about Elizabeth Murphy that called to a part of his soul he'd kept carefully guarded when she finally rose to leave. The church was dark, except for the single candle Samuel had lit. The flickering light played across her features as she gathered her shawl around her shoulders. "The town council will want to meet with you tomorrow," she said. "And there are several families who've been waiting for a preacher to perform weddings and baptisms. You'll find plenty to keep you busy." "I look forward to serving the community," Samuel replied, though his eyes never left her face. Elizabeth paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Preacher Harrison. I hope you find what you're looking for here." After she left, Samuel stood alone in the quiet church, the scent of her lavender perfume still lingering in the air. He tried to focus on his evening prayers, on the responsibilities that awaited him in this new place, on the souls he was called to shepherd. But his mind kept returning to green eyes and auburn hair, to a gentle voice and a strength that seemed to emanate from a spirit that had been tested but never broken. It's the first time in his adult life, Samuel Harrison found himself questioning whether his calling as a traveling preacher was truly what God intended for him, or if perhaps the Lord had brought him to Cedar Ridge for reasons that went far beyond his ministerial duties. The thought both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. Samuel's first Sunday service in Cedar Ridge drew a larger congregation than he had expected. The small church was nearly full, with families crowded into the wooden pews, and several men standing along the back wall. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating faces weathered by frontier life, but bright with curiosity about their new preacher. Elizabeth sat in the third pew, her hands folded in her lap, and Samuel found it difficult to concentrate on his sermon when his gaze kept drifting to her. She wore a green dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style that spoke of someone who took pride in her appearance despite the challenges of frontier living. His sermon that morning focused on faith in times of uncertainty, a theme he thought would resonate with people who had chosen to make their lives in the untamed territories. He spoke of how God's plan wasn't always clear, how sometimes what seemed like obstacles were actually opportunities for growth and discovery. As he delivered these words, he couldn't help but wonder if his own arrival in Cedar Ridge was an example of divine providence working in mysterious ways. After the service, the townspeople gathered outside to introduce themselves. Samuel met ranchers and shopkeepers, widows and young families, each with their own story of why they'd come to this remote corner of the world. Many mentioned Elizabeth's care of the church during the months without a preacher, and Samuel began to understand the important role she played in the community. "Mrs. Murphy has been our unofficial spiritual leader," explained Martha Henderson, an elderly woman whose husband ran the general store. "When my grandson took sick with fever last winter, she sat with us for 3 days and nights, reading scripture and praying. The boy pulled through. I swear it was her faith that helped him fight." Samuel felt a warmth in his chest at this confirmation of what he had already sensed about Elizabeth's character. She was more than just beautiful. She was a woman of genuine faith and compassion, someone who lived her beliefs rather than simply professing them. Over the following weeks, Samuel threw himself into his pastoral duties with renewed energy. He visited the sick, counseled troubled couples, conducted the weddings and baptisms that had been postponed, waiting for a permanent preacher. The work was familiar and fulfilling, but he found his thoughts constantly returning to Elizabeth. She continued to help with the church, arriving early each Sunday to arrange flowers and ensure everything was ready for service. They often found themselves alone together in the quiet sanctuary, discussing scripture or talking about the needs of various parishioners. These conversations revealed Elizabeth's deep understanding of human nature and her intuitive grasp of spiritual matters. "You have the heart of a minister," Samuel told her one afternoon as they arranged chairs for an evening prayer meeting. "Have you ever considered that God might be calling you to something more than you realized?" Elizabeth paused in her work, her hands stilling on the chair back she was adjusting. "I've often wondered about that," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel like there's something more I should be doing, some way I could serve that I haven't discovered yet." but I'm just a widow in a frontier town. What could I possibly offer beyond keeping house and helping neighbors? More than you know, Samuel said quietly. I've watched you these past weeks, Elizabeth. People seek you out when they're troubled. They trust you with their deepest concerns. You have a gift for bringing comfort and wisdom to difficult situations. Their eyes met across the small sanctuary, and Samuel felt the same jolt of connection that had struck him the night they first met. Elizabeth's cheeks colored slightly, and she looked away first, but not before he saw something in her expression that gave him hope. The turning point came on a Wednesday evening in late summer. Samuel had been in Cedar Ridge for nearly 2 months, and he'd grown to love both the town and its people. But more than that, he'd grown to love Elizabeth Murphy in a way that challenged everything he thought he knew about his calling. A severe storm had blown in from the mountains, bringing torrential rain and powerful winds that shook the small church building. Samuel had been working on his sermon when the storm hit, and he was surprised when Elizabeth appeared at the church door, soaked to the skin and breathless from running through the downpour. I was worried about the roof, she explained, wringing water from her skirts. The last big storm caused leaks near the altar. I thought you might need help moving things to keep them dry. Together, they worked to protect the church's furnishings from potential water damage. Moving hymnals and candlesticks away from the areas where the roof had leaked before, the storm raged outside, and the small building creaked and swayed in the powerful wind. When a particularly violent gust made the whole structure shudder, Elizabeth instinctively moved closer to Samuel, her hand briefly touching his arm. The contact sent electricity through both of them, and when Elizabeth realized what she'd done, she started to pull away. But Samuel caught her hand gently, preventing her retreat. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her green eyes wide in the flickering candlelight. Water droplets still clung to her hair and eyelashes, and Samuel thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful in his life. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," he continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I'm a man of God, called to serve him above all else. But I can't deny what's happening in my heart. I'm falling in love with you, Elizabeth. And I don't know what that means for my calling or my future." Elizabeth's breath caught, and for a long moment, she simply stared at him, her hand trembling in his grasp. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Samuel, I've been fighting the same feelings. I loved my husband, loved him dearly, and I never thought I could feel that way about anyone again. But you've awakened something in me that I thought was buried with him." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the emotional upheaval taking place in the small sanctuary. Samuel stepped closer, his free hand reaching up to cup Elizabeth's cheek. "What do we do?" he asked. "How do we reconcile these feelings with our faith, with our duties?" Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that what I feel for you doesn't diminish my love for God, if anything. It makes me understand his love more deeply." In that moment, with the storm raging around them and their hearts laid bare, Samuel made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. The morning after the storm brought an unusual clarity to Cedar Ridge. The air was clean and crisp, washed by the previous night's rain, and the mountains in the distance seemed to stand in sharper relief against the blue sky. But for Samuel, the clarity was more than atmospheric. The conversation with Elizabeth in the storm-tossed church had forced him to confront truths about himself that he'd been avoiding for weeks. He stood at his window, watching the townspeople emerge to assess the storm damage and begin repairs. Cedar Ridge was the kind of community where neighbors helped neighbors without being asked, and already he could see men gathering lumber and women organizing meals for the work crews. It was a place where people understood that survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. Elizabeth appeared in the street below, carrying a basket of fresh bread to share with the cleanup crews. She moved with purpose and grace, stopping to check on elderly Mrs. Patterson and helping young Tommy Henderson carry water buckets that were too heavy for his 8-year-old arms. Samuel watched her interactions with a mixture of admiration and longing. recognizing in her the same calling to serve others that had driven his own life's work. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Samuel opened it to find James Whitaker, the chairman of the town council, standing on his doorstep with a grave expression. "Morning, preacher," James said, removing his hat. "Wonder if we could have a word." Samuel invited him in, offering coffee and a chair by the small table that served as both desk and dining area. James was a man in his 50s, a successful rancher who had helped establish Cedar Ridge and served as an unofficial leader in the community. His weathered face spoke of years spent under the harsh western sun, but his eyes held the shrewdness of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "There's been talk." James began without preamble. "About you and Mrs. Murphy?" Samuel felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that happens in small towns," James replied. "People notice things. The way you look at her during services, how much time you spend together working on church business. Some folks are starting to wonder if there's more to it than Christian fellowship." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Samuel knew this moment had been inevitable. In a community as close-knit as Cedar Ridge, it was impossible to keep secrets for long, especially secrets of the heart. "What exactly are you asking me, James?" James leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I'm asking you to be straight with me, Samuel. Are you developing feelings for Elizabeth Murphy that go beyond what's proper for a preacher?" The direct question demanded an honest answer. Samuel had built his entire adult life on truth and integrity, and he wouldn't compromise those values now, even if honesty might cost him everything. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." James sat back in his chair, studying Samuel's face. "Well, I appreciate your honesty. The question now is what you plan to do about it." "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "I've never faced a situation like this before. My calling has always been clear, my path straightforward. But now, now you're discovering that being a man of God doesn't make you less of a man," James finished. It's not the first time a preacher has found himself torn between his calling and his heart. Samuel was surprised by the understanding in James's voice. He'd expected condemnation, perhaps even a demand that he leave town. Instead, he found something that resembled sympathy. "What happened in other cases?" Samuel asked. James was quiet for a long moment, gazing out the window at the cleanup efforts in the street below. "My brother was a preacher back in Missouri," he finally said. "Good man, dedicated to his calling. But he fell in love with a woman in his congregation, and he couldn't reconcile his feelings with what he thought his duty demanded. He left her and the town, moved on to another circuit. Never married, never settled down. Spent the rest of his life wondering what might have been." The story hit Samuel like a physical blow. He could see himself in that scenario all too clearly, forever riding from town to town, carrying the memory of Elizabeth Murphy like a wound that never healed. "Was he right to leave?" Samuel asked. "That's not for me to judge," James replied. "But I will tell you this. He was never the same after. Something vital went out of him when he made that choice. He served God faithfully until the day he died. But he never served with the same joy, same passion that he'd had before." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James stood and placed his hat back on his head. "For what it's worth," he said, "Elizabeth Murphy is one of the finest women I've ever known. She's been through hell and came out stronger for it. If you're going to make a decision about your future, you could do a lot worse than considering what would make her happy too." After James left, Samuel found himself unable to concentrate on his usual work. He tried to write Sunday's sermon, but the words wouldn't come. He attempted to study scripture, but his mind wandered. Finally, he gave up and walked to the church. Hoping that prayer and solitude might bring him some clarity, he found Elizabeth there, as he somehow knew he would. She was tending the wildflowers on the altar, replacing those that had been damaged by the previous night's storm. She looked up when he entered, and he saw his own uncertainty reflected in her green eyes. "I wondered when you'd come," she said softly. "James? Whitaker paid me a visit this morning," Samuel told her. "People are talking about us." Elizabeth's hand stilled on the flowers, but she didn't seem surprised. I suspected they might. It's hard to hide feelings this strong in a town this small. What do we do, Elizabeth? How do we move forward from here? She turned to face him fully. And Samuel was struck again by her beauty, but more than that, by the strength and wisdom that seemed to radiate from her very being. I've been thinking about that all night, she said, and I keep coming back to one question. What would love look like if it truly came from God? The question caught Samuel off guard. He'd been so focused on the conflict between his feelings and his calling that he hadn't considered the possibility that they might not be in opposition at all. What do you mean? He asked. Elizabeth moved closer to him, her eyes never leaving his face. I mean that maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe the love between a man and woman isn't something that competes with love for God, but something that reflects it. Maybe it's another way of serving Him. Her words sparked something in Samuel's mind. A new way of looking at his situation that he hadn't considered before. You're talking about marriage, he said. I'm talking about partnership, Elizabeth replied. Two people serving God together, supporting each other in that service, making each other stronger in faith and purpose. Samuel felt his heart racing as the implications of her words sank in. But I'm called to travel, to serve different communities. A married preacher with a settled wife? Who says I have to be settled? Elizabeth asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Who says I can't travel with you, serve alongside you? I've been caring for this community's spiritual needs for months. Maybe it's time I consider doing that on a larger scale. The idea was radical, challenging everything Samuel thought he knew about his calling and his future. But as he looked at Elizabeth, standing there in the morning light with hope and determination shining in her eyes, he began to see possibilities he'd never imagined before. The weeks following Samuel and Elizabeth's conversation in the church were filled with a tension that seemed to permeate every aspect of life in Cedar Ridge. They continued their work together, but now every glance, every accidental touch, every shared moment carried the weight of unspoken possibilities and unresolved questions. Samuel found himself preaching with a passion he hadn't felt in years. His sermons took on new depth as he explored themes of love, sacrifice, and the courage required to follow one's true calling. The congregation responded to this newfound fervor, and attendance at Sunday services grew steadily. But Samuel knew that his inspiration came not from solitary communion with the divine, but from the presence of the woman who sat in the third pew, listening to his words with an attention that made his heart race. Elizabeth threw herself into her church work with similar intensity. She organized a women's Bible study group, started a program to help struggling families, and began teaching reading to some of the town's children. Her activities kept her busy from dawn to dusk. But Samuel recognized the furious energy for what it was, an attempt to exhaust herself enough to quiet the longing that grew stronger with each passing day. The breaking point came on a warm September evening when Samuel was walking back to his quarters after visiting a sick parishioner. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the sense of cooling earth and distant wood smoke. As he passed Elizabeth's small house on the edge of town, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through an open window. He stopped without thinking, drawn by the haunting melody she was playing. It was a hymn he recognized. Come thou fount of every blessing, but Elizabeth's interpretation gave it a melancholy beauty that spoke to something deep in his soul. Unable to resist, he approached the window and looked inside. Elizabeth sat at an old upright piano, her fingers moving with practiced grace across the keys. Her hair had come loose from its pins and cascaded down her back in waves of auburn silk. She wore a simple white blouse and dark skirt, and in the golden lamplight, she looked like something from a dream. But it was the expression on her face that stopped Samuel's breath. Her eyes were closed, and tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she played, her whole being poured into the music. Samuel stood transfixed, watching this private moment of vulnerability and beauty. He knew he should leave, should respect her solitude, but he found himself unable to move. The music seemed to speak directly to his heart. expressing all the longing and conflict he'd been feeling but couldn't put into words. When the song ended, Elizabeth remained still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned and looked directly at him through the window. Their eyes met, and Samuel saw his own desperation reflected in her gaze. Without a word, she rose from the piano bench and walked to the front door, opening it and stepping out onto the small porch. Samuel moved toward her as if drawn by an invisible force, his rational mind screaming warnings that his heart refused to hear. "I can't do this anymore," Elizabeth whispered when he reached the bottom of the porch steps. "I can't pretend that what I feel for you is just Christian fellowship. I can't sit in that church every Sunday and watch you preach about love and sacrifice." While my own heart is breaking, Samuel climbed the steps slowly, each one bringing him closer to a moment that would change everything. "I know," he said. "I've been lying to myself, thinking I could ignore these feelings, thinking they would fade if I just focused on my duties. But they're only getting stronger." They stood facing each other on the small porch, the evening breeze stirring Elizabeth's loose hair and carrying the scent of her lavender soap. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat in the silence between them, could feel the pull of her presence like gravity. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. When she didn't move, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears on her cheeks. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that I can't lose you. I've spent my whole adult life believing that my calling required me to be alone, to give up personal happiness for the sake of service. But you've made me wonder if maybe I've been wrong about that." Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "I've been a widow for 2 years," she said. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days alone with my memories. I never imagined I could feel this way again, Elizabeth." Samuel breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. She opened her eyes and looked directly into his. "Please," she whispered, "don't undo my buttons." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning beyond their literal sense. Samuel understood that she wasn't talking about clothing, but about the barriers they'd both built around their hearts, the careful defenses that kept them safe from the kind of vulnerability that true love demanded. But even as she spoke the words, her hands moved to the front of his shirt, her fingers working at the buttons with trembling urgency. Samuel's breath caught as he realized what she was really saying, that despite her fears, despite the risk, she was choosing to trust him with her heart. His own hands moved to the small buttons at the throat of her blouse, his fingers clumsy with emotion and desire. Each button he freed felt like a small revelation, a step deeper into intimacy and connection than either of them had experienced in years. "If we do this," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion, "there's no going back. Everything changes." "Everything has already changed," Elizabeth replied, her hands now flat against his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart. "The moment you rode into town, my whole world shifted. I can't pretend otherwise anymore." The last of the evening light faded as they stood there, slowly removing the barriers between them, both literal and metaphorical. Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside him as Elizabeth's trust washed over him like a benediction. For the first time in his life, he understood that love wasn't a distraction from his calling to God, but a deeper expression of it. But even as he surrendered to the moment, even as he held Elizabeth in his arms and felt the walls around his heart crumble, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. He was a man of God, a leader in the community, someone people looked to for moral guidance. What they were doing, what they were feeling, would challenge everything he'd been taught about duty, propriety, and the life of a minister. As Elizabeth's lips met his in a kiss that tasted of tears and hope and desperate longing, Samuel Harrison felt his faith in the rightness of his old life shatter like glass. In its place, something new and uncertain began to grow, something that would either lead him to a deeper understanding of divine love or destroy everything he'd built his identity upon. The choice, he realized with crystal clarity, would define not just his future, but his very soul. The morning after their intimate encounter, Samuel woke to a world transformed. Cedar Ridge looked the same, but everything felt different. His hands trembled as he dressed, each button reminding him of Elizabeth's touch the night before, filling him with equal measures of joy and terror at the church. Elizabeth was arranging flowers at the altar. Their eyes met across the sanctuary, both understanding they had crossed an irreversible line. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension and newfound vulnerability. "Good morning," Elizabeth said quietly, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Did you sleep well?" Samuel asked, moving closer until he could smell her lavender soap. "Not particularly. I spent most of the night thinking about everything." Samuel began to speak about the previous night. But Elizabeth interrupted him. "Before you say anything, I need you to know I don't regret what happened between us. For the first time in 2 years, I felt truly alive." Her words intensified the conflict in Samuel's heart. "I don't regret it either, but I can't ignore what it means for my calling, for my position in this community." Elizabeth moved closer. "What if it doesn't have to mean anything negative? What if God brought you here not just to serve this community, but to find the partner He intended for you?" Samuel wanted desperately to believe her. The church leadership has never looked favorably on married ministers. They believe a man's devotion should be entirely focused on God and His flock. "Then maybe the church leadership is wrong," Elizabeth said with returning spirit. "Maybe they've forgotten that even Jesus had close friends, people He loved deeply. Maybe they've confused isolation with holiness." Mrs. Patterson's arrival forced them apart, back into their public roles. But the tension remained throughout the day, making concentration impossible for Samuel. That evening brought an unexpected visitor, Reverend Marcus Thornton, the regional church supervisor. Samuel's heart sank, recognizing the austere man who held power over his ministry. "Reverend Harrison," Thornton said gravely, "I've received concerning reports about your conduct here. Reports of inappropriate familiarity with Mrs. Elizabeth Murphy." Samuel had expected this confrontation. "Who made these reports?" "That's not important. What matters is whether they're true. Are you romantically involved with this woman?" Samuel faced a crossroads. He could lie and probably save his position. But his entire adult life had been built on truth and integrity. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." Thornton's face darkened with anger. "Do you understand what you've done? You've violated every principle of ministerial conduct. You've compromised your calling and brought shame upon the church." A surprising calm descended over Samuel. Have I discovered something about God's plan that I never understood before?" "Don't you dare try to justify your weakness with theology," Thornton snapped. "A minister's duty is to God alone. Personal desires are distractions that lead souls astray. And what about love?" Samuel's voice grew stronger. "What about the commandment to love one another as Christ loved the church? Elizabeth Murphy is one of the finest Christian women I've ever known. She's devoted her life to serving others. If loving someone like that is weakness, then perhaps I've been misunderstanding strength." Thornton stood abruptly. "You're deluding yourself. This woman has led you away from your true calling. I'm relieving you of your duties effective immediately. You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things and leave Cedar Ridge." Beneath the shock, Samuel felt unexpected relief. The choice between his calling and his heart had been made for him. "Very well," Samuel said, standing. "I accept your decision. But I won't leave Cedar Ridge. What do you mean?" "I mean, my calling may be to serve God differently than I originally thought. This community needs spiritual guidance. And I believe I can provide that whether I carry an official church position or not." "You can't seriously be considering starting some independent ministry?" Thornton said with disdain. "The church will never recognize it. You'll have no authority, no support." Samuel thought of Elizabeth's words about partnership. "Maybe I don't need the church's recognition to do God's work. Maybe what I need is faith, compassion, and someone who shares my commitment to helping others." After Thornton left, Samuel sat alone, contemplating the magnitude of what had happened. In one conversation, he'd lost the identity that had defined him for over a decade. He was no longer Reverend Samuel Harrison, but simply Samuel, a man in love. He was uncertain about his future, but strangely at peace. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Elizabeth stood at his door, her face pale with worry. "I heard that Reverend Thornton was here. I was afraid this might happen." "He dismissed me," Samuel told her. "I'm no longer authorized to serve as a minister." Elizabeth's face crumpled with grief and guilt. "This is my fault. If I had been stronger, if I had kept my distance—" "No," Samuel said firmly, taking her hands. "This isn't your fault. This is the result of a choice I made freely. A choice I don't regret, but your calling. Your life's work, my life's work, is to serve God and help people," Samuel interrupted. "I can do that with or without official church sanction, but I can't do it without you." Elizabeth looked up at him with tear-bright eyes. "What are you saying?" Samuel took a deep breath, knowing his next words would commit him to an unimaginable path. "I'm saying I want to marry you, Elizabeth. I want us to build a life together here in Cedar Ridge or wherever God leads us. I want to serve him alongside you as your husband and partner." For a long moment, Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. Then, slowly, a smile transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." As he pulled her into his arms, Samuel felt his last doubts fade away. He might have lost his official position, but he'd found something far more precious. A love that deepened his faith rather than diminishing it. And a partner who would help him serve God in ways he'd never thought possible. Outside, the sun set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about their future. But tonight, Samuel Harrison held the woman he loved and knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. 3 months after Reverend Thornton's visit, Cedar Ridge witnessed a wedding that would be remembered for years to come. Samuel Harrison, no longer officially a minister, but still deeply respected by the community, married Elizabeth Murphy in the same small church where they had first fallen in love. The ceremony was performed by a traveling preacher who had arrived just in time, as if sent by divine providence. The entire town turned out for the celebration. James Whitaker gave Elizabeth away, and Martha Henderson wept openly as the couple exchanged vows they had written themselves. Samuel promised to love Elizabeth with the same devotion he had once reserved for his solitary calling, while Elizabeth pledged to support him in whatever form his service to God might take. But the real surprise came during the reception, when James Whitaker stood to make an announcement that stunned even Samuel and Elizabeth. "Friends," he said, raising his glass of apple cider, "I have some news to share. The town council met last week, and we've made a decision about our spiritual leadership. We've asked Samuel and Elizabeth Harrison to serve as our community ministers, not under the authority of any distant church hierarchy, but as servants of this community and our Lord." The applause that followed was thunderous. Samuel felt Elizabeth's hand squeeze his as the full meaning of the announcement sank in. They wouldn't have to leave Cedar Ridge after all. They could build their life here, serving the people they had come to love. But Samuel isn't authorized by the church, called out one of the townspeople. "How can he perform weddings and baptisms?" James smiled. "As it happens, the territorial government has granted Samuel the authority to perform such ceremonies as a justice of the peace. And as for matters of spiritual guidance, well, we reckon a man's calling comes from God, not from a bunch of officials in distant cities who've never set foot in our town." Over the following years, Samuel and Elizabeth built a ministry unlike anything either had imagined in their younger days. They served not just Cedar Ridge but the entire region, traveling together to remote settlements and homesteads, bringing comfort to the sick, counseling troubled couples, and helping communities establish their own centers of worship. Elizabeth proved to be a gifted minister in her own right. Her natural compassion and deep understanding of Scripture made her sought after for counseling women and families. She developed innovative approaches to religious education for children and organized networks of mutual support among the isolated farmwives scattered across the territory. Samuel found that marriage didn't diminish his calling but enhanced it. Elizabeth's presence grounded him in ways he hadn't expected, making him more effective in his ministry rather than less. Together, they tackled challenges that would have overwhelmed either of them alone. When drought threatened the region, they organized relief efforts. When conflicts arose between ranchers and farmers, they served as mediators. When epidemics struck, they were among the first to volunteer their services. Regardless of personal risk, their home became a gathering place for the community, where people knew they could find not just spiritual guidance, but practical help and genuine friendship. Elizabeth's piano, the same one where Samuel had first glimpsed her private anguish, now filled their parlor with music during weekly gatherings where neighbors shared meals, stories, and songs. But perhaps the greatest testament to their partnership came 5 years after their marriage. When Reverend Thornton returned to Cedar Ridge on an inspection tour of the region, Samuel and Elizabeth welcomed him into their home with genuine Christian hospitality, serving him dinner and listening politely as he explained the church hierarchy's new policies. "I must admit," Thornton said over dessert, "I expected to find this community in spiritual decline after the irregularities of 5 years ago. Instead, I find what appears to be a thriving, faith-centered society." "God's work doesn't depend on human institutions," Samuel replied gently. "It depends on hearts committed to serving Him and serving others." Thornton looked around the comfortable parlor, noting the obvious signs of a happy marriage and successful ministry. "And your doubts? The crisis of faith that led you to abandon your calling?" Samuel glanced at Elizabeth, who was sitting beside him with her hand resting on his arm. "I didn't abandon my calling, Reverend Thornton. I discovered what it truly was." After Thornton left the next morning, Samuel and Elizabeth stood on their front porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains that surrounded their adopted home. Elizabeth was expecting their first child, and her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "The path we chose?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Elizabeth asked something important. He thought about the official position he'd lost, recognition he'd forfeited, the comfortable certainty he'd abandoned. Then he looked at the woman beside him, at the community they'd helped build, at the life they'd created together through faith, love, and mutual service. "Never," he said, meaning it completely. "I spent years thinking that serving God required sacrifice and loneliness. But you taught me that sometimes the greatest service comes through partnership, through love that multiplies rather than divides our devotion." Elizabeth smiled and turned her face up to his. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think God has a sense of humor. He brought a traveling preacher to a small frontier town, intending him to settle down. And he gave a lonely widow a new purpose by making her fall in love with a man whose calling could take her anywhere." Samuel chuckled, struck by the truth of her observation. "You may be right. Though I have to say, if this was God's plan all along, He certainly took His time revealing it." "The best things usually take time," Elizabeth replied, reaching up to straighten his collar in a gesture that had become both familiar and precious. "Love, faith, understanding, they all develop slowly, like crops growing in good soil." As they stood there together, watching Cedar Ridge come to life in the morning sun, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had begun his adult life believing that his calling required him to stand apart from others, to maintain a careful distance that would allow him to serve without personal attachment or distraction. But Elizabeth had shown him a different way, a path where love enhanced rather than compromised his ability to serve God. Through their partnership, he had discovered that the heart's capacity for devotion was not limited or finite, but expandable. Loving Elizabeth hadn't diminished his love for God. It had taught him new depths of what divine love could mean. Their marriage had scandalized some, certainly. The church hierarchy still viewed them with suspicion. There were communities where they weren't welcome because they operated outside official religious authority. But they had also found acceptance and appreciation in places they never expected, among people who cared more about authentic faith than institutional credentials. As Elizabeth went inside to prepare for the day ahead, Samuel remained on the porch for a few more minutes, offering his morning prayer of gratitude. He thanked God for Elizabeth, for their unborn child, for the community that had embraced them, and for the unexpected path that had led him to a deeper understanding of his calling. The sun was fully up now, promising another beautiful day in the territory that had become home. In a few hours, Samuel and Elizabeth would set out together to visit a new settlement that had requested their help in establishing a church. It was the kind of work Samuel had always done, but now he would do it with his partner beside him, her strength complementing his own, standing there in the morning light. Samuel Harrison felt no doubt about the choices he had made. He had found his true calling, not in spite of love, but because of it. And he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Elizabeth would face them together. Their faith strengthened by their union and their service to others deepened by the love they shared. The traveling preacher had finally found his home,